The year was 1396, and in the shadowed halls of the French royal palace, a transaction was being finalized that would horrify even the most hardened observers of medieval politics. But this wasn't a negotiation over lands or gold or military alliances. This was something far more sinister. In those dimly lit chambers, powerful men were haggling over the body and future of a 6-year-old child, treating her flesh as currency in a game of thrones that would consume her entire existence. Her name was Isabel de Valois, and her story represents one of history's most chilling examples of innocence, sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. What happened to this little French princess would shock the courts of Europe and create ripple effects that would last for generations. But perhaps most disturbing of all is how those who witnessed her fate chose to remain silent, complicit in a system that viewed children not as human beings deserving protection, but as diplomatic tools wrapped in silk and crowned with jewels. This isn't just another tale from dusty medieval chronicles. This is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, about how societies have always been willing to sacrifice their most vulnerable members when the stakes are high enough. Isabel's tragedy reveals the brutal machinery that operated behind the pageantry of royal courts, where a child's tears meant nothing compared to the promise of peace between warring kingdoms. Today, we're going to uncover the full horror of what was done to Isabel de Valois, a girl who became a queen before she could even spell her own name. We'll explore how she was used, abused, and ultimately destroyed by a system that demanded everything from her, while giving nothing in return. Her story will take us through the blood-soaked battlefields of the 100 Years' War, into the treacherous world of medieval diplomacy, and finally to a deathbed where a 19-year-old woman would breathe her last, having lived more tragedy in her brief existence than most would endure in a lifetime. But to understand the full scope of Isabel's nightmare, we must first examine the world that created it. Europe in the late 14th century was a continent drenched in blood and consumed by endless warfare. For nearly 60 years, England and France had been locked in a conflict that would later be known as the 100 Years' War, though neither nation understood then that their struggle would stretch across multiple generations. This wasn't merely a dispute over territory or succession. This was total warfare that had bled both kingdoms dry. Noble families had been decimated on battlefields from Crécy to Poitiers. Entire regions lay in ruins. The flower of European chivalry had been cut down in their prime, leaving behind widows, orphans, and a generation scarred by violence. Into this world of perpetual conflict, Isabel de Valois was born, a princess whose fate would be determined not by love or choice, but by the desperate calculations of men who saw children as solutions to problems they themselves had created. France in the 1390s presented a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. Isabel's father, Charles VI, had begun displaying the terrifying symptoms of what historians would later call his madness. During his fits of insanity, this king of one of Europe's most powerful nations would forget his own identity, attack his own courtiers with savage fury, and sometimes become convinced that his body was made of fragile glass that would shatter at the slightest touch. These episodes of madness created a power vacuum that ambitious nobles rushed to fill. While Charles raved in his chambers or cowered from imaginary threats, his brothers and uncles governed France in his name, making decisions that would shape the kingdom's destiny. The irony was crushing. A mad king's daughter would be offered as a symbol of stability to a foreign court. Her small body expected to carry the weight of diplomatic promises her own father was too insane to comprehend. Across the English Channel, England faced its own internal turmoil. Richard II sat upon the throne, a man of refined tastes and autocratic tendencies who had made dangerous enemies among his powerful nobility. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died childless in 1394, leaving him vulnerable and alone. At 29 years old, he desperately needed both a new queen and a foreign alliance that could strengthen his precarious position against domestic rivals who questioned his fitness to rule. The marriage negotiations that would seal Isabel's fate began as a desperate gambit for peace. Both kingdoms had reached the point of exhaustion. Their treasuries were empty, their armies depleted, their people weary of endless taxation to fund wars that seemed to benefit no one except the gravediggers. French diplomats, led by Isabel's own uncles, saw an opportunity to purchase decades of peace with the most precious currency they possessed, the body of an innocent child. The specific terms they negotiated reveal the cold calculation behind this arrangement. They offered England an unprecedented truce lasting 28 years, sealed not with signatures on parchment, but with the marriage of a 6-year-old girl to a man who could have been her father. The dowry alone was staggering, 800,000 francs, an astronomical sum that represented years of French tax revenue. Yet even as these powerful men debated the price of peace, the child at the center of their negotiations remained blissfully unaware that her childhood was being bartered away in distant chambers. Medieval marriage customs, particularly among European royalty, operated according to moral frameworks that modern sensibilities find deeply disturbing. Girls were routinely promised in marriage while still in their cradles, wed as children, and expected to begin producing heirs the moment their bodies became capable of bearing children. The Catholic Church, despite officially setting the age of consent at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, routinely granted dispensations for younger marriages when political necessity demanded such arrangements. But even by these brutal standards, Isabel's situation was extreme. At 6 years old, she was younger than most royal brides, and the age gap between her and her intended husband was shocking even to medieval observers. Contemporary chronicles record the unease felt by nobles who witnessed these negotiations, men who had themselves participated in arranged marriages, but found something uniquely disturbing about this particular match. The diplomatic chess game surrounding Isabel's betrothal reveals the complex web of interests that determined her fate. The Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Bold, supported the marriage enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to advance his own ambitious plans for expanding Burgundian influence. The Duke of Gloucester, Thomas of Woodstock, opposed the match vehemently, viewing any alliance with France as a betrayal of English interests and a sign of Richard's unfitness to rule. Between these competing factions stood a little girl who simply wanted to play with her younger sisters and listen to stories from her nursemaid, while diplomats argued over trade rights and territorial concessions. Isabel remained in the royal nursery, building castles with wooden blocks and chasing butterflies in the palace gardens. She had no understanding that her life was being dissected and reconstructed by men who would never have to live with the consequences of their decisions. The preparations for Isabel's transformation from French princess to English queen began months before her actual departure. French courtiers descended upon the royal nursery like vultures, measuring the 6-year-old child for gowns heavy with gold thread that would weigh more than she did. They fitted her for shoes designed for ceremony rather than comfort, teaching her to walk in garments that restricted her movement and made simple childhood activities impossible. Language tutors arrived to drill English phrases into a mind that could barely comprehend them. Etiquette masters attempted to teach her the complex protocols of royal behavior that even adult nobles found challenging to master. Isabel was being systematically stripped of her childhood, each lesson and fitting another step in her transformation from a playful child into a political symbol designed to embody the peace between two warring nations. Her mother, Isabeau of Bavaria, supervised these preparations with a mixture of maternal grief and political resignation. Chronicles describe her weeping openly as seamstresses fitted her daughter for wedding clothes, yet she never questioned the fundamental necessity of the match. The Queen understood that royal daughters were born for precisely such purposes. She herself had been married at 14 to a stranger whose language she didn't speak, in a foreign court where every smile concealed a potential threat. The journey from France to England began in October 1396, a procession that stretched for miles across the autumn countryside. Isabel rode in a specially constructed litter, surrounded by tapestries depicting romantic scenes from courtly literature that she was far too young to understand. 400 French nobles accompanied her, along with wagons containing her massive dowry, her few personal possessions, and the collection of dolls she had refused to leave behind despite the protests of her handlers. Witnesses along the route recorded how the child queen waved excitedly at peasants who had gathered to see the procession pass, completely unaware that she was waving goodbye to her homeland forever. To her, this was simply another adventure, like the fairy tales her nurses had read to her. She had no concept of the finality of what was happening, no understanding that the familiar landscapes rolling past her litter window were disappearing from her life as surely as if they were being swallowed by the earth itself. The meeting between Isabel and her future husband took place near Calais, in elaborate pavilions erected specifically for this momentous occasion. Richard II, attempting to show kindness to his child bride, had commissioned special gifts: a tiny crown crafted to fit her small head, miniature royal regalia scaled down to child proportions, and a white pony named Blanche that she could actually manage to ride. When they first encountered each other, Isabel reportedly hid behind her governess's skirts, overwhelmed by the sight of the tall stranger who would become her husband. Richard, for his part, seemed genuinely moved by the child's obvious fear and confusion. He knelt to her level, speaking gently in the few French phrases he had learned for this occasion, offering her sweets and small toys to ease her terror. The wedding ceremony itself was a study in grotesque contrasts that would haunt the memories of all who witnessed it. Richard, resplendent in cloth of gold that caught the light of 1,000 candles, towered over his tiny bride like a giant from the fairy tales she still believed in. Isabel, dressed in blue velvet studded with pearls that weighed nearly as much as she did, had to stand on a specially constructed platform just to reach his hand during the ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ritual with solemn dignity, his Latin words washing over a child who spoke only French and understood nothing of what was being promised in her name. When asked for her consent, Isabel repeated the memorized phrases her tutors had drilled into her, the foreign syllables tumbling from her lips without comprehension. She was performing a role in a play whose plot remained completely mysterious to her young mind. English chronicles of the time describe Richard's behavior toward his child bride as protective, even tender. He allegedly told the French delegation that he would serve as father, brother, and husband to Isabel, a promise that reveals both his genuine affection and the fundamental horror of the situation. No matter how kind his intentions, the spectacle remained what it was: a 29-year-old man taking a 6-year-old bride, regardless of assurances that the marriage would remain unconsummated until she came of age. The wedding feast that followed was a surreal spectacle of medieval pageantry and childhood innocence, colliding in ways that disturbed even the hardened nobles present. Isabel sat at the high table, her feet dangling far above the floor, while minstrels sang elaborate songs of courtly love and romantic devotion. She fell asleep during the third course, her small head resting against Richard's shoulder, while diplomats around them celebrated the peace her tiny body had purchased for both their kingdoms. The contrast between childhood innocence and political machinery had never been more stark. Here was a little girl who still played with dolls, now being toasted as the savior of 2 nations. The irony was lost on none of the observers, yet none dared speak against an arrangement that promised to end decades of bloodshed. Isabel's sacrifice was deemed acceptable because the alternative was continued war, and what was one child's happiness compared to the lives of thousands of soldiers? Isabel's arrival in England marked the beginning of an existence suspended between childhood and queenship, a liminal space where she was neither fully one thing nor the other. At Windsor Castle, Richard established a separate household for his child queen, staffed with French attendants who could speak her native language and maintain some connection to the homeland she was already beginning to forget. Lady de Courcy, a French noblewoman of impeccable reputation, became her governess and primary guardian, attempting to create a bubble of normalcy within the rigid structure of the English court. This woman, herself a mother, understood the impossible task she faced: how to protect a child's innocence while preparing her for the brutal realities of royal life. The daily routine crafted for Isabel reveals the bizarre contradictions of her position. Mornings were devoted to lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic, taught in French with English phrases gradually introduced like medicine mixed with honey. She learned to sign her name in shaky letters: Isabel, Regina Anglii, a title that meant nothing to her beyond the difficulty of forming the complex letters. Afternoons might include the simple pleasures of childhood: playing with her dolls, walking in the castle gardens, or listening to stories read by her French attendants. Yet evenings required her presence at state functions, where she sat beside Richard wearing a crown that gave her headaches, smiling at nobles who bowed to a queen who still believed in fairy tales and magic kingdoms. Richard's treatment of Isabel became a subject of intense court gossip and political speculation. By all contemporary accounts, he was genuinely fond of the child, showering her with gifts and ensuring her comfort in ways that went far beyond political necessity. He commissioned illuminated books of fairy tales written in both French and English, imported French sweets and delicacies she missed from home, and even arranged for puppet shows to entertain her during the long winter evenings. Yet this kindness existed within a fundamentally exploitative framework that no amount of genuine affection could disguise. Isabel remained what she had always been: a political hostage, however gilded her cage might be. Her value lay not in her personality or preferences, but in what her presence symbolized about the peace between England and France. The English nobility's reaction to their child queen varied wildly according to their political allegiances and personal temperaments. Some, charmed by her innocence and obvious vulnerability, became genuinely protective of the little French princess. They would bring her small gifts, teach her English songs, and compete for her childish attention with the enthusiasm of doting uncles and aunts. Others, particularly those who opposed Richard's policies and viewed the French alliance as a betrayal of English interests, saw Isabel as a living symbol of their king's poor judgment and foreign sympathies. They treated her with cold correctness, fulfilling their ceremonial obligations while making their displeasure clear through subtle slights and calculated indifference. Isabel herself, with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes possess, distributed her affections based on simple criteria: who brought her treats, who told the best stories, who smiled at her with genuine warmth rather than political calculation. She had no understanding of the complex factions surrounding her, the intricate web of loyalties and betrayals that determined how each courtier interacted with her. Court documents from this period provide heartbreaking glimpses into Isabel's attempts to fulfill her impossible role. She practiced signing royal decrees in her childish handwriting, though she couldn't read what they contained. She memorized speeches in English that she delivered phonetically at ceremonies, the words rolling off her tongue without meaning. On one documented occasion, she reportedly asked her governess why everyone bowed to her, unable to grasp the abstract concept of queenship that governed her daily existence. The isolation of Isabel's position became increasingly apparent as months turned into years. While she was surrounded by luxury and constant attendance, she had no real companions her own age. The few English noble children permitted to interact with her did so under strict supervision, their play regulated by protocol and observed by watchful adults who ensured that nothing inappropriate occurred. She wrote letters to her sisters in France, dictated to secretaries who translated her childish French into formal diplomatic language. These missives, preserved in various archives, reveal a growing homesickness disguised as polite inquiries about family health and court news. Between the lines, one can read the desperate longing of a child who missed the simple pleasures of sibling companionship and maternal affection. Perhaps most poignantly, records show that Isabel kept asking when she could visit her mother, not understanding that her marriage had created an unbridgeable political gulf between them. Richard, attempting to console her, made promises of future visits that political reality would never allow. She was a queen in name and a wife-in-law, but in truth she remained what she had always been, a lonely child in a foreign land, playing at roles she couldn't comprehend. The psychological impact of this existence on a developing child can only be imagined. Isabel was being forced to mature at an unnatural pace, while simultaneously being denied the normal experiences that would have fostered genuine growth. She existed in a state of perpetual performance, always on display, always required to be something other than what she naturally was. By 1399, when Isabel was 9 years old, the carefully constructed political foundations of her strange existence began to crumble with terrifying speed. Richard II, never beloved by his nobility, had grown increasingly autocratic and paranoid in his exercise of royal power. His taxation policies, designed to fund his lavish court and artistic patronage, had created widespread resentment among both nobles and commoners. His perceived favoritism toward French interests, symbolized most obviously by his child queen, provided his enemies with powerful propaganda weapons. They painted him as a king more French than English, more concerned with foreign alliances than domestic welfare. Isabel, absorbed in her lessons and games, remained completely oblivious to the storm gathering around the husband she barely knew but had learned to trust. Henry Bolingbroke's invasion of England in July 1399 marked the beginning of the end of Isabel's brief reign. As Richard's cousin and a man the king had exiled for political reasons, Henry returned ostensibly claiming only his rightful inheritance as Duke of Lancaster. But ambition, once unleashed in medieval politics, rarely stopped at its stated objectives. As Henry's forces grew and Richard's supporters melted away like snow in spring sunshine, it became increasingly clear that far more than lands and titles hung in the balance. The crown itself, and with it the fate of a 9-year-old queen, would soon be decided by the brutal arithmetic of political power. The speed with which Richard's kingdom collapsed would have been shocking even to seasoned observers of medieval politics. Towns that had welcomed the king with pageantry just months earlier now opened their gates to Henry's advancing army without firing a single arrow. Lords who had sworn eternal loyalty to Richard abandoned him with the casual indifference of merchants changing suppliers. The machinery of royal power, so imposing when viewed from the throne room, proved as fragile as morning frost when tested by genuine opposition. Isabel, sequestered in her chambers at Windsor Castle, understood none of this political earthquake reshaping her world. Her days continued with their established rhythm of lessons and play, supervised by French attendants who themselves were beginning to whisper anxiously about the future. The child queen noticed that fewer English nobles attended her evening appearances, that conversations stopped when she entered rooms, that her governess wore an expression of barely concealed worry. Richard's final meeting with Isabel before his capture remains one of history's most heartbreaking scenes. Chronicles describe how he visited her chambers at Windsor, finding her playing with a new litter of puppies that had been born in the castle kennels. The sight of this man, once so powerful and commanding, kneeling before a 9-year-old child to explain that he must undertake a dangerous journey, captures the complete reversal of fortune that had overtaken them both. Isabel, with the intuitive understanding that children sometimes possess about adult distress, began crying before Richard finished speaking. She begged him not to leave, clinging to his robes with small hands that had grown accustomed to his protective presence. Neither of them could have known that this moment of genuine affection between a broken king and a confused child would be their last together on earth. The deposition proceedings that followed Richard's capture were swift and merciless. Parliament, now firmly under Henry's control, discovered numerous grounds for removing their anointed king from the throne. They cited his arbitrary rule, his financial mismanagement, his alleged tyranny, and his dangerous foreign sympathies. Yet throughout these legal proceedings, one question loomed larger than all the constitutional issues being debated: what to do with Isabel de Valois? Never before had England dealt with a foreign child queen whose husband had been forcibly removed from power. Legal scholars pored over dusty precedents, searching for guidance that simply didn't exist. Some argued that Isabel should be returned to France immediately, her marriage dissolved along with Richard's reign. Others, more calculating in their approach, recognized her continued value as a political asset and potential hostage. The news of Richard's deposition reached Isabel through her governess, who struggled to find words that a 9-year-old could comprehend. How do you explain to a child that her husband is no longer king, that she is no longer queen, that the entire structure of her existence has been swept away by forces beyond anyone's control? Lady de Courcy attempted to frame the news as gently as possible, but Isabel's response revealed a wisdom beyond her years. Her first question, recorded by witnesses, was heartbreakingly simple. Did this mean she could finally go home to her mother? The complexities of her situation, her value as a diplomatic pawn, the ongoing negotiations about her substantial dowry, the delicate question of her legal status, were far beyond her comprehension. She understood only that the tall man who had been kind to her was gone, and perhaps now, the homesickness that had plagued her for 3 years might finally end. But the adult world had other plans for Isabel de Valois. Henry IV, having successfully seized the throne through a combination of political maneuvering and military force, now faced the challenge of legitimizing his rule. His treatment of Richard's child queen would send important signals about his character and intentions to both domestic and foreign observers. The conditions of Richard's imprisonment at Pontefract Castle remain historically murky, shrouded in the deliberate obscurity that medieval chroniclers employed when discussing uncomfortable truths about royal deaths. What is certain is that by February 1400, the deposed king was dead. Whether he was murdered on Henry's direct orders, starved to death through deliberate neglect, or died from the natural consequences of imprisonment and despair, the result remained the same. Isabel de Valois, at 9 years old, had become a widow. The news was kept from her for weeks, while her guardians debated how to break such devastating information to a child who had already endured more trauma than most adults could bear. When Isabel finally learned of Richard's death, witnesses reported a grief that seemed to age her instantly. The playful child who had giggled at puppet shows was replaced by a solemn little figure who refused food and demanded to wear mourning clothes like a proper widow. Her reaction to the news revealed depths of understanding that surprised the English court. Despite her youth, Isabel grasped the finality of death in ways that her earlier separations from family had not prepared anyone to expect. She clung to the few personal gifts Richard had given her. A small prayer book, a golden ring sized for her tiny finger, a miniature portrait of them together on their wedding day. As if these objects could somehow preserve his memory against the forces trying to erase it. The weeks following Richard's death saw Isabel existing in a strange limbo between childhood and widowhood. She insisted on maintaining the formal mourning periods prescribed for royal deaths, conducting herself with a dignity that amazed observers. Yet she was still fundamentally a child, asking questions about heaven and whether Richard's spirit could visit her, seeking comfort in the simple rituals of bedtime stories and lullabies. Henry IV's proposal for resolving Isabel's situation was as coldly calculated as it was pragmatic. Rather than return her to France and lose the substantial dowry that had accompanied her marriage, he suggested that she marry his own son, the future Henry V. This arrangement would keep her dowry in England while maintaining some vestige of the French alliance that had originally justified her presence. The proposal revealed Henry's complete misunderstanding of the child he was attempting to manipulate. Isabel's response to this suggestion demonstrated a steel beneath her childish exterior that shocked the English court. Despite her tender age, she understood enough about loyalty and betrayal to recognize what was being asked of her. Marriage to the son of the man who had destroyed her husband would be the ultimate betrayal of Richard's memory.
Rostam,
her refusal was delivered with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. She reportedly declared that she would rather become a nun than marry into the family responsible for Richard's downfall. This defiance from a 10-year-old sent shockwaves through both the English and French courts, revealing that Isabel possessed a will that years of political manipulation had failed to break. The English nobility found themselves divided on how to handle a recalcitrant child widow whose refusal to cooperate threatened to complicate their king's legitimacy. Some advocated forcing the marriage, arguing that a child's preferences were irrelevant when measured against state necessity. Others, perhaps moved by her dignified grief or recognizing the dangerous optics of compelling a child into marriage against her will, supported her right to refuse. Henry IV, already facing rebellions and legitimacy challenges from multiple quarters, could not afford to be seen as a tyrant who forced children into unwanted marriages. The image of a grieving child widow being dragged to the altar would have provided his enemies with devastating propaganda ammunition. Reluctantly, he accepted that Isabel's cooperation could not be compelled through force alone. During this period of political uncertainty, Isabel's household at Sunning Palace became a peculiar court in exile. The French nobles who had accompanied her to England maintained the fiction of her queenship, addressing her with full royal honours despite the changed circumstances. She held miniature audiences where she received petitioners, mostly her own servants requesting small favours, and distributed alms like a proper medieval queen. This play acting served important psychological functions for a child struggling to maintain her identity in the face of overwhelming political forces. By continuing the rituals of queenship, Isabel preserved some sense of dignity and purpose, even as the adult world attempted to reduce her to a mere bargaining chip. Her French attendants, understanding the importance of these ceremonies to their young mistress, participated with the solemnity of adults honouring a child's need for stability. The letters Isabel dictated during this period reveal a growing sophistication in her understanding of political realities. She wrote carefully crafted missives to her father, Charles VI, pleading for his intervention while demonstrating remarkable diplomatic skill for someone so young. Her correspondence with the French court walked a delicate tightrope, expressing her desire to return home while avoiding language that might be construed as criticism of her English hosts. Most poignantly, she composed letters to her mother filled with longing barely disguised by formal diplomatic language. These documents, preserved in various archives, provide heartbreaking glimpses into the private grief of a child separated from everything familiar and comforting. Between the lines of polite inquiries about court news and family health, one can read the desperate homesickness of a little girl who simply wanted to be held by her mother. The financial disputes surrounding Isabel's dowry added another layer of complexity to her already precarious situation. France demanded the return of the 800,000 francs paid for a marriage alliance that had been dissolved by Richard's deposition and death. England, facing severe financial constraints and threats on multiple fronts, refused to return money that had already been spent on military campaigns and court expenses. Isabel herself became collateral in this monetary standoff, held in comfortable captivity while two kingdoms haggled over her monetary worth. The irony was not lost on observers that a child who had been treated as priceless when her marriage promised peace was now being valued in precise financial terms as her two potential homes argued over the cost of her return. Throughout 1401 and 1402, negotiations continued fitfully between English and French representatives. Isabel, now 11 and 12 years old, grew increasingly vocal in her desire to return to France. She staged small acts of resistance that demonstrated her growing political awareness, refusing to appear at certain court functions, speaking only French even when she understood English perfectly well, and insisting on wearing mourning clothes despite Henry's orders to dress more appropriately for her station. These acts of defiance, modest though they were, revealed a developing personality that refused to be completely subordinated to political necessity. Isabel had learned perhaps the most important lesson a powerless person can master: that even when you control nothing else, you can still control your own consent and cooperation. Her quiet rebellions served notice that she would not be an entirely passive participant in whatever fate awaited her. The gradual shift in political circumstances that would eventually enable Isabel's return to France reflected broader changes in the European balance of power. Henry IV, beset by rebellions from multiple directions and facing constant threats to his legitimacy, could no longer afford to maintain the expensive fiction of Isabel's captivity. Moreover, her continued presence in England served as a rallying point for supporters of the deposed Richard, who saw in the child widow a living symbol of their lost cause. By late 1401, pragmatic considerations had begun to outweigh the symbolic value of keeping Isabel in England. Henry's government, desperate to secure French neutrality while dealing with domestic challenges, opened serious negotiations for her repatriation. The terms they ultimately agreed to satisfied neither party completely, but reflected the exhausted state of both kingdoms after years of warfare and political instability. The financial settlements that preceded Isabel's release were as complex as they were bitter. England agreed to return her person to France, but retained most of her substantial dowry, claiming expenses for her maintenance and education during her 5-year residency. France, eager to reclaim their princess, but unwilling to appear weak in the negotiations, accepted terms that left both sides feeling cheated, yet relieved to end the standoff. Isabel herself, now 12 years old and far more sophisticated than the frightened child who had arrived in England 6 years earlier, was consulted on none of these arrangements, despite their complete determination of her future. She learned of her impending return to France through her governess, who delivered the news with a mixture of joy and apprehension about how much the child had changed during her exile. The preparations for Isabel's departure from England revealed the strange attachments that had formed during her captivity. Several of her English ladies-in-waiting wept openly at the prospect of losing their young mistress. These women, who had watched a terrified 6-year-old transform into a poised 12-year-old with wisdom far beyond her years. Even some nobles, who had initially resented the French child queen, now spoke with genuine fondness of her dignity and grace under impossible circumstances. Isabel herself displayed the complex emotions of someone leaving a prison that had also been her home. The joy of finally seeing her family again was tempered by anxiety about returning to a homeland she could barely remember. France had become an abstraction in her mind, a collection of half-remembered faces and fading sensations of childhood comfort. England, for all its cruelties, had become familiar ground where she understood the rhythms of daily existence. The journey to Dover was marked by ceremonies that highlighted the fundamental contradictions of Isabel's status. She was no longer Queen of England, yet protocol demanded she travel with royal honours. Towns along the route received her with elaborate pageantry, perhaps recognizing the tragedy of her circumstances even if they couldn't openly acknowledge it. At Dover, Henry himself appeared to bid her farewell, reportedly expressing regret for her suffering in words that rang hollow from the man who had orchestrated her husband's downfall. The Channel crossing in July 1401 became Isabel's first sea voyage since her arrival as a child bride 5 years earlier. Witnesses described how she stood at the ship's rail for hours, watching the white cliffs of Dover recede into the distance, while clutching a small portrait of Richard that she had somehow managed to hide from her English guardians throughout the negotiations for her release. Her reception at the French port revealed the awkwardness of her homecoming. The child who had departed as a playful princess was returning as a widow, bearing herself with the measured dignity of someone who had learned to survive in hostile territory. French nobles who remembered the giggling 6-year-old found themselves bowing to a composed 12-year-old whose eyes held experiences they could barely fathom. The reunion with her family proved even more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Isabel struggled to recognize siblings who had grown and changed in her absence, while they stared at a sister who seemed more foreign than familiar. Her younger sisters, now approaching the ages she had been when she left, looked at her with a mixture of awe and incomprehension. How do you reconnect with someone who has lived through experiences that have no equivalent in your own sheltered existence? Isabel de Valois died in childbirth at 19. Her brief life a testament to the price paid when children become pawns in the games of kings. From that 6-year-old bride trembling at an altar she couldn't understand to the young mother who breathed her last holding portraits of all those she had loved and lost. Her story reveals the brutal machinery that operated behind medieval pageantry. Her tragedy reminds us that some horrors transcend their historical moment, echoing still in our modern world, where innocence continues to be sacrificed on the altars of power and political ambition.